The chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms cast their crystalline light upon the polished floor below, each faceted pendant trembling with the vibrations of 100 conversations, 100 careful laughs, 100 whispers that cut more cleanly than any blade. It was February in the year 1817, and outside the tall windows, London lay frozen beneath a sky the colour of pewter, the cold seeping through glass and stone to settle in the very marrow of the city. Yet the chill without was nothing compared to the frost that greeted Miss Eleanor Hartley as she stood at the periphery of the ballroom, her gloved hands clasped before her with a composure that cost her more than anyone watching could possibly know. She wore a gown of pale blue silk, modest in its elegance, neither ostentatious nor plain, and her dark hair was dressed simply, without the elaborate arrangements favoured by the other young ladies present. Around her swirled the cream of society, the daughters of earls and viscounts, the wives of men whose titles stretched back centuries, their perfumes mingling in the warm air rose and lavender, bergamot and jasmine, while their gowns whispered secrets in fabrics worth more than most families earned in a year. Eleanor had learned to stand very still in moments such as these, to keep her chin level and her expression serene, even as she watched ladies turn deliberately away when she approached, even as fans snapped shut like small acts of violence, even as eyes slid past her as though she were merely another piece of furniture, unworthy of notice or acknowledgement. She was the daughter of Thomas Hartley, whose ships now commanded respect in every port, from Bristol to Bombay, whose recent fortune from shipping had purchased an introduction to society that no amount of wealth could make welcome. The voucher to Almack's had been obtained through persistence and strategic donations, a golden ticket that promised entry but guaranteed nothing of acceptance, and Eleanor understood with painful clarity that she stood in this glittering assembly on sufferance, an outsider permitted to observe, but never to belong. How curious, she thought, her gaze moving across the sea of pale faces and paler souls, that silk and jewels should disguise such poverty of spirit. But the thought brought no comfort, only a sharper awareness of her solitude, and she found herself remembering her father's face 3 weeks prior when the voucher had arrived. The hope in his eyes that his daughter might find in these halls what he could never give her: belonging, acceptance, perhaps even a match that would secure her future. She would not shame him by fleeing, would not grant these peacocks the satisfaction of seeing her wounded, though each turned back and each whispered comment behind raised hands, struck with precision against the armor of her dignity. The cold from outside seemed to have found its way inside after all, settling around her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl, and Eleanor stood alone in the crowd, watching the dancers spin past in their elaborate patterns, wondering if this was to be her lot forever at the edges, forever looking in. Her father's merchant gold, transforming not into acceptance, but merely into a more expensive form of isolation. Lady Pemberton swept past Eleanor with the precision of a military maneuver, her silver gown catching the candlelight as she paused just within earshot, her voice carrying to the small cluster of debutantes gathered near the refreshment table. "I do wonder at the standards these days," she pronounced, her words falling like coins into still water, creating ripples that spread across the immediate vicinity. When one can purchase entrance to any establishment in London, one must question whether anything retains its proper meaning. Why, my own grandmother would have expired from shock to see the daughters of trade mingling among those of breeding. The emphasis on the final word was delicate, surgical in its cruelty, and Eleanor felt the comment land even as she kept her expression carefully neutral, her hands tightening imperceptibly within her gloves. She had encountered Lady Pemberton twice before at smaller gatherings, and each time the woman had perfected the art of acknowledging Eleanor's presence only to demonstrate her insignificance, a peculiar talent that seemed to bring its practitioner genuine satisfaction. Across the room, Miss Worthington caught sight of Eleanor and executed a performance worthy of Drury Lane, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical dismay, as though she had not noticed Eleanor's approach until the very last moment, her body recoiling with such exaggerated distaste that her companions turned to observe the source of her distress. "Oh," Miss Worthington breathed, the single syllable loaded with volumes of contempt. "I had not realized. That is, I thought perhaps you might be more comfortable near the other area." She gestured vaguely toward a darker corner of the room, her meaning crystalline despite the imprecision of her words. Eleanor stopped walking, her spine straightening by inches, and met Miss Worthington's gaze with steady calm. "I am quite comfortable here, I thank you," she replied, her voice level and clear, and she watched something flicker across the other woman's face, surprise, perhaps, or irritation that her barb had not drawn visible blood. Even the patronesses, those arbiters of social acceptability, who had granted her the voucher, regarded her with barely concealed disdain, their conversations ceasing when she drew near, their eyes sliding past her as though she were constructed of glass, transparent, and easily overlooked. They wrap their cruelty in silk and call it refinement, Eleanor thought, observing the elaborate dance of exclusion unfolding around her. They have perfected the art of wounding without ever raising their voices, of destroying with a glance what my father spent years building. She found herself remembering the afternoon 3 weeks prior when the voucher had arrived, how her father had stood in the doorway of her sitting room with the precious paper held carefully in his weathered hands, hands that had once worked the docks before fortune and business acumen had elevated him beyond his origins. His face had been transformed by hope, by the belief that this small rectangle of approval might open doors for his daughter that would forever remain closed to him, that she might find among the quality what he had never been permitted to seek: acceptance, belonging, perhaps even affection, uncolored by considerations of commerce. She would not fail him, would not retreat before these peacocks with their hereditary pride and their shallow measures of worth. She would stand here at the edge of their glittering world and endure whatever cuts they chose to inflict, would maintain her composure even as each snub and each whispered comment carved away small pieces of her dignity, because to flee would be to confirm their judgment, to accept their valuation of her as less than, as unworthy, as forever marked by the sin of having been born to a man who built his fortune through labor rather than inheritance. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted with such subtle precision that Eleanor felt it before she understood its cause. A change in the quality of attention, a collective turning of heads that rippled through the assembly like wind moving across water. The conversations did not cease entirely but lowered in volume, became edged with a particular quality of awareness, and even the musicians seemed to play with greater care, as though the notes themselves must be more perfect in this suddenly altered air. Alexander Greystone, Duke of Ashworth, stood at the entrance to the ballroom with the unconscious authority of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose, and Eleanor found herself observing him with the detached clarity that her isolation afforded, seeing him as one might study a portrait in a gallery, beautiful, remote, utterly separate from the realm of ordinary human warmth. He was perhaps 30 years of age, tall and lean, with the kind of aristocratic features that seemed carved rather than grown, all clean lines and sharp angles, his dark hair styled with careless perfection, his evening clothes fitted with the precision that only the finest tailors could achieve. There was something winter-cold about him, something that suggested frost settling deep into stone, and Eleanor watched as the room arranged itself around him with the automatic deference accorded to power and ancient title. The matchmaking mamas straightening their daughters' postures with subtle touches, the gentlemen offering small bows of acknowledgement, the very air seeming to make space for his passage. His reputation preceded him like a herald announcing royalty. The Duke of Ashworth, whose lineage stretched back beyond the conquest, whose pride was legendary, whose discrimination against the nouveau riches was so well established that his presence at Almack's, where vouchers were granted to anyone with sufficient funds and minimal scandal, was itself remarkable, a condescension that the patronesses undoubtedly treasured as validation of their establishment's continued relevance among the truly elite. Eleanor had heard the whispers about him during her brief weeks navigating the edges of society, had learned that he attended few gatherings, accepted fewer invitations, and had rebuffed every attempt by ambitious mothers to secure him for their daughters with a coldness that bordered on cruelty. His gaze moved across the assembled crowd with dismissive efficiency, sliding past faces and forms as though cataloguing and discarding in a single motion, and Eleanor felt the moment when his eyes reached her position at the periphery, felt the brief pause as his attention snagged on her presence before moving onward. But something made her refuse to look away, some stubborn core of dignity that had carried her through the evening's accumulated slights, and when his gaze returned to her, as though surprised to find her still watching, she met it directly, without coyness or calculation, without the simpering invitation she had observed other young ladies employing when seeking to capture masculine attention. For the space of 3 heartbeats they regarded each other across the glittering expanse of the ballroom, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his expression, a hairline crack in the marble perfection of his composure, surprise, perhaps, or the faint stirring of curiosity that something had not behaved as expected. Then his attention moved onward, and he stepped fully into the room, and Eleanor released a breath she had not realized she was holding, her heart beating with unaccountable force against her ribs. They are 2 of a kind, she thought, watching him accept the obsequious greetings of those deemed worthy of his notice, both standing alone in crowded rooms, both wrapped in armor against the world. But where her isolation had been imposed by circumstances of birth and fortune, his seemed chosen, deliberate, a fortress constructed from the inside, with walls designed to keep the world at a permanent distance, and she wondered what wound could have taught a man born to such privilege the necessity of such thorough guardedness. 3 weeks had passed since the evening at Almack's, 3 weeks during which Eleanor had attended 2 more gatherings with similarly dispiriting results, and she had begun to accept her position on the margins of society as permanent, when her father's study door opened one grey March afternoon, and she saw his face. They saw the defeat written there, in lines that seemed to have appeared overnight, aging him a decade in the span of hours. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made her set down her book and rise immediately, crossing to where he stood beside his desk, his hand resting on a stack of correspondence, as though drawing strength from the physical solidity of paper and ink. The story emerged in fractured pieces. His business partner, a man he had trusted for 15 years, had been conducting transactions under the company name without authorization, had made investments in ventures that bordered on criminal, and now scandal threatened to engulf them all, to destroy not merely their fortune, but their name, and to render Eleanor even more unmarriageable than her merchant origins had already made her. "There is a way," her father said, and she heard the shame in his voice, the self-loathing of a man forced to use his daughter as currency in a transaction that should never involve human hearts. "An intermediary approached me yesterday, a solicitor named Pembroke, who handles affairs for the Duke of Ashworth." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest at the name, remembering those winter-grey eyes, that aristocratic coldness, the brief moment when their gazes had held across the ballroom. "The Duke requires an heir," her father continued, and his words coming faster now as though speed might make them less painful, "but he has refused every debutante presented to him, has made clear his contempt for the mercenary nature of the marriage market." Pembroke suggested that a business-like arrangement might be more palatable, a contract with clear terms, a marriage of pure convenience without the pretense of affection or the complications of romantic expectation. "Your inclusion in society, our family's reputation secured through alliance with his name, and in return—" He could not finish, but Eleanor understood what was not spoken. In return, she would provide the necessary heirs and then fade into whatever separate existence the Duke deemed appropriate for a wife acquired through negotiation rather than courtship. The shock of it struck her first that such a proposal could even exist, that her life might be determined by a contract as cold as those her father signed for cargo shipments. But shock gave way quickly to something more complex, a careful weighing of impossible choices. "How long do I have to consider?" she asked, and her father's face crumpled slightly at the steadiness of her voice. At her failure to weep or protest or demand, he find another solution. "Pembroke requires an answer by week's end," he replied. "Eleanor, I would not ask this if there were any other way, if I had not already exhausted every possibility, if the alternative were not complete ruin." She moved to the window, looking out at the modest London square where their townhouse stood, thinking of the Duke's cold perfection, his obvious disdain for anything touched by commerce, and found herself remembering that brief moment when surprise had flickered across his features at her refusal to look away. Perhaps his coldness conceals something, she thought, some wound or fear that manifests as ice. "I will do it," she said, turning back to face her father, and watched relief and anguish war across his features in equal measure. "I will marry the Duke of Ashworth, and I will face whatever this arrangement brings with such dignity as I can muster, because you have given me everything, and I will not see it destroyed." The Duke of Ashworth's London townhouse possessed the same austere elegance as its owner, all clean lines and muted colours, The drawing room into which Eleanor was shown, speaking of wealth so old it required no ostentation, its beauty residing in perfect proportion rather than ornament, and she found herself oddly steadied by this clarity of purpose, this refusal of pretense that seemed to characterize both the space and the man, who now rose from beside the fireplace, to offer her a bow of such precise correctness that it might have been measured with a ruler. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice carried the same cool distance she remembered from that brief moment at Almack's. "I trust Pembroke has explained the nature of this meeting." Eleanor accepted the seat he indicated, arranging her skirts with deliberate care, using the small gesture to center herself before meeting his gaze directly. "He has explained that your Grace seeks a marriage of convenience, a business-like arrangement that would provide you with heirs while offering my family the protection of your name and position." Something flickered in his expression approval, perhaps at her directness. "Then we may dispense with unnecessary courtesies," he replied, moving to stand before the fireplace, his posture suggesting a man delivering terms to a subordinate rather than proposing marriage to a woman. "I require legitimate heirs to secure the succession. In return, you will bear the title of Duchess, command whatever household staff and funds you require, and after the necessary children are produced, we shall maintain separate residences and separate lives. You will have complete freedom in your activities, provided you avoid scandal. I ask only discretion and the fulfillment of the dynastic obligation." The coldness of it struck Eleanor like a physical blow, yet she found herself oddly grateful for the honesty, for the absence of false sentiment that would have made the arrangement more painful in its deception. "And what of respect?" she asked quietly, watching him carefully. "I do not expect affection, Your Grace, nor do I harbor romantic delusions, but I would ask for mutual respect, a recognition of shared humanity, even within such a clinical arrangement." His eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing, and Eleanor saw the sharp intelligence behind the aristocratic coldness, saw him measuring her words against whatever expectations he had carried into this meeting. "You are remarkably composed for a young woman discussing what amounts to a contractual exchange of her person," he observed, and there was something almost like curiosity threading through the statement. "I am practical, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Circumstances have taught me that survival sometimes requires accepting situations one would never have chosen, and making the best of them through clarity rather than sentiment." He regarded her in silence for a long moment, and Eleanor had the distinct impression of being examined as one might study a painting in uncertain light, searching for details that might reveal unexpected depths. "Your father mentioned that your mother maintained extensive gardens," she said, shifting the conversation with deliberate intent, "and that the grounds at your country estate include a duchess's garden that was her particular project. I confess I have always found solace in growing things, in the patience required to cultivate beauty from careful attention." The change in him was immediate and unmistakable, a tightening of his jaw, a sudden rigidity in his shoulders, something like pain flashing across his features before the mask of cold courtesy slammed back into place with almost audible force. "My mother has been dead these 18 years, he said, his voice carrying a finality that precluded further discussion. "The garden is no concern of yours. Now, if you find the terms acceptable, Pembroke will draw up the necessary documents. The wedding will take place within the month at my country estate. I see no purpose in yen-long engagement given the nature of our arrangement." Eleanor rose, understanding that the interview had concluded, that she had somehow touched upon territory too painful for even this cursory negotiation, and found herself thinking that the Duke of Ashworth was not cold at all, but rather a man who had learned to freeze his heart as protection against some unbearable wound. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace," she said quietly, and watched something that might have been relief or resignation cross his features before he rang for the butler to show her out, and Eleanor departed, knowing that she had just agreed to marry a man who was utterly unknown to her, a beautiful fortress of a man who permitted no entry, and she wondered whether the desperate arrangement that would make her a duchess might somehow, impossibly, become something more human in the careful accumulation of days. The wedding took place on a grey April morning that threatened rain, the sky hanging low and leaden over the ancient chapel that stood at the edge of the Duke's country estate, its Norman stones dark with age and moisture, and Eleanor walked up the aisle alone, her father having returned to London to manage the salvaging of his business, toward a man who waited with the same cold courtesy he might have shown to a business associate, his expression revealing nothing, as she took her place beside him, and they spoke vows that felt more like contractual recitation than sacred promise. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of murmured Latin and the scent of old incense, the small gathering of witnesses consisting primarily of the Duke's distant relatives, who regarded Eleanor with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain, and she felt the weight of their assessment, the calculations behind their polite congratulations at the sparse reception that followed in the great hall, where servants had laid out an impressive spread that no one seemed inclined to enjoy. The Duke remained at her side throughout, with impeccable manners and complete emotional absence, introducing her to various relations whose names she immediately forgot, their faces blurring together into a sea of aristocratic features that held no warmth, no welcome, only the careful neutrality of people witnessing a transaction they considered beneath the family dignity, and Eleanor found herself utterly alone, despite being surrounded by people, despite now bearing one of the oldest titles in England. When evening came and the last guests departed, the Duke escorted her to her chambers, a vast suite decorated in pale blue and cream that might have been beautiful had it not felt so much like a gilded cage, and bid her good night with a formal bow before retreating to his own rooms in a distant wing, leaving her to face her wedding night alone with only her new lady's maid for company, and Eleanor sat at the window, looking out over dark grounds she could barely see, and wondered what kind of life she had bargained herself into. The first weeks of marriage established a pattern of such careful distance that Eleanor might have doubted her husband's existence had she not encountered him occasionally in the corridors or sat across from him at dinner, meals taken in near total silence, broken only by the most necessary exchanges about household matters or weather. His responses to any attempt at genuine conversation brief to the point of curtness, and she learned quickly to stop trying, to accept the reality that she had indeed married a man who intended to remain a stranger. She occupied her days exploring the vast estate, walking its grounds in all weather, discovering the extensive library where she could lose herself in books, and it was during one such exploration that she found the walled garden, overgrown and neglected, its gate rusted but still bearing a brass plaque that read, "The Duchess's Garden," and something in Eleanor stirred at the sight of it, at the evidence of another woman who had once held her title and perhaps felt equally displaced in this cold, beautiful prison of stone and tradition. "I will build a life here," Eleanor thought, standing among the tangled roses and choked pathways, "even if it is not the life I might have chosen, even if I must do so entirely alone. I will find purpose and perhaps even contentment in these small freedoms he has granted me." And she turned back toward the house with renewed determination, unaware that in a window high above, the Duke stood watching her small figure among the ruins of his mother's sanctuary, his expression unreadable, his hand pressed against the glass, as though reaching toward something he had convinced himself he could never touch. Eleanor began to notice the small inconsistencies in the first month of her marriage, subtle observations that suggested the Duke of Ashworth was perhaps not the cold, heartless aristocrat he appeared to be in her presence, and the first crack in that perception came when she witnessed him speaking with Mrs. Henshaw, the elderly housekeeper who had served his family for 40 years, his entire demeanor softening as he inquired after her rheumatism and insisted she delegate the heavier tasks to younger staff, his hand gentle on her shoulder in a gesture of such unaffected kindness that Eleanor found herself motionless in the corridor, watching this glimpse of warmth she had never seen directed toward herself. The observations accumulated like evidence in a trial she had not known she was conducting. The stable master, mentioning casually that his Grace had pensioned off 3 elderly retainers with generous allowances, rather than turn them out when they could no longer work. The steward's comment that the Duke personally reviewed every tenant situation and had quietly forgiven rents during the difficult harvest 2 years prior. The way the servants moved around him without the cringing deference she had witnessed in other great houses, suggesting a master who did not rule through fear or capriciousness. One afternoon, seeking a book in the library, Eleanor came upon the Duke in conversation with his land steward, and she paused unseen in the doorway, arrested by the animation in her husband's voice as he discussed crop rotation and drainage improvements, his face alive with an enthusiasm she had never witnessed, his entire bearing transformed from cold marble to warm flesh, as he spoke of his responsibility to the land and those who worked it, and she understood suddenly that the Duke of Ashworth was capable of deep feeling, of genuine care, only not for her, never for her. "We must ensure the tenant cottages are repaired before winter," he was saying, leaning over a map spread across the desk, his finger tracing roads and boundaries. "And I want Thompson's family to have the larger cottage. 5 children in those 2 rooms is unconscionable." And the steward was nodding, clearly accustomed to a master who concerned himself with such details. When the Duke glanced up and saw Eleanor standing there, and the transformation was immediate and heartbreaking, all that warmth and animation draining from his features as the familiar mask of cold courtesy settled back into place like a door slamming shut. That evening at dinner, emboldened by what she had witnessed and by a growing curiosity about the man she had married, Eleanor ventured a comment about a novel she had been reading, one she had discovered in the library, with a bookmark suggesting recent attention. And for a moment she saw surprise flicker across his features before he responded with a brief observation about the author's technique, and though the exchange lasted barely 2 minutes before he retreated back into silence, Eleanor felt as though she had glimpsed something precious through a briefly opened window, some evidence that beneath the ice there lived a man of intelligence and depth who had chosen to lock himself away from her, and she found herself lying awake that night, wondering what wound had taught him such complete self-protection, what betrayal had convinced him that warmth was weakness, and whether there existed any key that might unlock the fortress he had built around his heart, any patience or persistence that might convince him she was not his enemy, but perhaps, impossibly, might someday be his friend. Weeks passed, and Eleanor found herself drawn repeatedly to the walled garden, that forgotten sanctuary that seemed to call to something deep within her own neglected heart, and she began the work of restoration with her own hands, refusing to relegate the task entirely to the gardeners, finding something almost sacred in the act of pulling weeds from around rose bushes that had once been carefully tended, of clearing pathways that had disappeared beneath years of creeping ground cover, and it was the head gardener, old Morrison, who had served the family for decades, who told her in his gentle burr that this had been the late Duchess's particular domain, that she had spent hours here each day, until her sudden death from fever had left it orphaned. Eleanor learned that the Duke had been only 12 when his mother died, that he had ordered the garden locked afterward and forbidden anyone to tend it. And this knowledge settled in her chest like a stone, this evidence of a wound so deep that even 15 years could not heal it, a grief that had calcified into the cold remoteness she encountered daily. And she worked among the roses with new tenderness, understanding that she was touching something precious, something that connected her to both the woman who had created this beauty and the boy who had loved her enough to preserve it as a shrine, even in ruin. She was kneeling in the dirt on a warm afternoon in late May, her hands deep in soil as she worked to free a particularly stubborn root, her dress already ruined and her hair escaping its pins, when she sensed rather than heard another presence and looked up to find the Duke standing at the garden entrance, his face utterly unguarded in a way she had never witnessed, and the pain in his eyes was so raw and so immediate that Eleanor felt it like a physical blow, understanding in that instant that her restoration of his mother's garden had reopened something he had kept carefully sealed. "I did not mean to intrude upon your work," he said, his voice strange and rough, and he made as though to leave. But Eleanor found herself speaking quickly, instinctively. "Please, do not go. I should have asked your permission before beginning this. I did not think," and she trailed off, uncertain, still kneeling there with earth on her hands and genuine distress on her face, that he might think her presumptuous or cruel. He stood frozen for a long moment, some internal battle playing across his features, and then, to her utter astonishment, he stepped fully into the garden and spoke with halting care. "She died here, my mother. In this garden she had been feeling ill but insisted on coming out to see the roses blooming, and she collapsed there, by that wall, and was gone before nightfall," and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet devastation in his words, at this first real thing he had ever shared with her. "I am so sorry," she said softly, rising to her feet but making no move to approach him, sensing his fragility. "I lost my own mother when I was 14. She died in the spring as well, and for years I could not bear the scent of the flowers that had been blooming then." And she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition of kindred grief. And when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "You understand, then, why I could not?" And she nodded, completing his thought with quiet certainty. "Why you had to preserve it exactly as it was, because changing it would have felt like losing her again." And they stood there in the sun-dappled garden that had become suddenly a bridge between them. And he did not leave. He did not retreat behind his walls, but instead asked in a voice that held the faintest tremor, "Would you tell me what you have planned for the restoration?" And Eleanor began to speak of her vision, watching wonder dawn across his face as she described honoring what his mother had created while bringing it back to life. And neither of them noticed as the afternoon lengthened into evening, too absorbed in this first genuine conversation, this tentative crossing of the distance that had separated them since the day they wed. The thaw, once begun, continued with the inexorable patience of spring yielding to summer, a slow accumulation of small moments that built upon one another, like stones, creating a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. And Eleanor found herself noticing the subtle shifts with a heart that beat faster each time their paths crossed in the corridors of the great house. The way his slight nod of acknowledgement began to carry something warmer than mere courtesy, the ghost of what might almost be called a smile touching his lips when their eyes met over breakfast. The dinners that had once been exercises in painful silence began to extend beyond the merely necessary. Conversations that had lasted bare minutes, now stretching to a quarter hour, then half, then longer still, until Eleanor realized one evening that they had been sitting at table for nearly an hour, discussing the merits of different philosophers, his eyes alive with an intellectual engagement she had only glimpsed that day in the library. And when she offered a particularly dry observation about Rousseau's contradictions, he made a sound that was almost impossibly the beginning of laughter before he caught himself, and the warmth that had briefly animated his features made her breath catch in her throat. She discovered quite by accident that he rode out each morning at dawn, and the next day found herself in the stables at that early hour, and though no explicit invitation had been extended, when he saw her mounted and waiting, something flickered across his face that might have been pleasure, and without words they began to ride together through the misty mornings, their horses moving in companionable parallel across the grounds, and these silent rides became a ritual neither acknowledged but both anticipated, the barriers between them lowering incrementally with each shared sunrise. A week of rain in June confined them both to the house, and Eleanor found herself drawn to the library, where she discovered him already in residence, and instead of the awkward retreat she had expected, he gestured to a chair near the fire with a question about what she was reading, and somehow the afternoon dissolved into a remarkable conversation that ranged from literature to politics to philosophy, and she watched astonishment cross his features when she revealed the breadth of her education. Her father's progressive belief that a woman's mind deserved cultivation equal to any man's, and he said quietly, almost to himself, "I had not expected, that is, I have never met anyone who—" And he stopped, clearly struggling with something, and Eleanor understood that he was discovering she was not what he had assumed, not a merchant's daughter grasping for status, but a woman of genuine intellect and depth. The household staff, those keen observers of their employers' moods, began to exchange meaningful glances as they witnessed the Duke seeking out the Duchess's company rather than avoiding it, as they heard conversation and even occasional laughter from the dining room rather than the oppressive silence that had characterized those first months. And Mrs. Henshaw remarked to the housekeeper that she had not seen His Grace so animated since before his mother's death, that the coldness that had settled over him like frost seemed finally to be melting. Eleanor tried to guard her heart, tried to maintain the careful distance that would protect her from further hurt, but she found it increasingly impossible as she witnessed more of the man beneath the armor, in the intelligence and dry humor and unexpected kindness that he had kept hidden away, and she acknowledged to herself late one night, lying awake in her solitary chamber, that she had fallen in love with her husband deeply and completely, and the knowledge was both joy and agony, because she could not know if this growing warmth between them was merely friendship or something more, could not know if his heart remained as locked as his mother's garden had once been, or if perhaps, impossibly, he might be learning to feel for her something of what she felt for him. Spring arrived with its inevitable demands, and the Duke informed Eleanor over breakfast one morning in late April that they must return to London for the season. his tone carefully neutral as he explained the social obligations of their position, and Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at the prospect of leaving the sanctuary they had built in the countryside, this fragile thing growing between them that seemed too delicate to withstand the harsh scrutiny of society. But she nodded her agreement with the same composure she had cultivated since girlhood, understanding that duty demanded this return. The journey to the London townhouse felt like traveling backward through time, each mile returning them to the formality and distance that had characterized their early marriage, and Eleanor watched the walls reconstruct themselves around her husband with each passing hour. The warmth that had begun to animate his features retreating behind the cold mask of aristocratic indifference, and she told herself that this was natural, that he must present a certain face to society, but the loss of their hard-won intimacy felt like a physical ache. The first ball they attended together as a truly married couple, though only she knew how incomplete that truth remained, was at the Marchioness of Westbrook's residence, and Eleanor stood at her husband's side in a gown of sapphire silk that had cost more than her father had once earned in a month, the Ashworth diamonds cold against her throat, and she felt the familiar prickle of hostile attention as they were announced, the whispers that followed them like a malicious breeze, and though she held her head high, she could feel the old wounds reopening, the knowledge that to these people she would always be the merchant's daughter who had somehow ensnared a duke. Lady Pemberton approached with her particular brand of poisonous courtesy, her smile sharp as glass as she remarked, "How lovely you look. Your Grace, though I suppose one can purchase elegance even if one cannot inherit it." And Eleanor felt her husband stiffen beside her, and when he spoke his voice carried the cutting edge of winter frost. "Lady Pemberton, I would caution you to measure your words more carefully when speaking to my Duchess." And the older woman paled and retreated, and Eleanor should have felt vindicated, but instead she felt only confusion, because the coldness in his tone had been directed as much at the situation as at Lady Pemberton. And when Eleanor looked up at him seeking reassurance, his face was a perfect blank, and he excused himself to speak with a group of gentlemen across the room, leaving her standing alone. The evening devolved into a nightmare echo of that first night at Almack's, Eleanor once again isolated at the periphery, except now she wore a duchess's coronet, and the isolation felt more complete because she had tasted something different, had begun to believe that perhaps she might belong somewhere, might be wanted for herself, and the Duke's public defense, followed by private distance, confused and hurt her more than the simple cruelty of strangers. It was late in the evening when Eleanor, seeking a moment of respite from the relentless social performance, stepped into a withdrawing room and heard voices from the partially open door of an adjacent parlour, Lady Summersby's distinctive laugh followed by her arch observation, "Of course she trapped him, what else would a merchant's daughter aspire to but a coronet?" Though I grant she was cleverer about it than most, playing at indifference when we all know she must have calculated every step. And another voice, Miss Worthington perhaps, replied with false sympathy, "Poor Ashworth bound to a woman so far beneath him, though I suppose he needed the money from her father's settlement." And Eleanor stood frozen, the words striking like physical blows, and the worst part was the terrible whisper of doubt that crept through her mind. The fear that perhaps her husband believed this too, that perhaps his withdrawal was rooted in the suspicion that she was exactly what these women claimed, a calculating opportunist who had somehow manipulated circumstances to trap him. She attempted to raise the matter with him that night, waiting in the drawing-room of the townhouse until he returned from his club, and when he entered and saw her still awake, something flickered across his face that might have been guilt or fear before the shutters came down completely. And she said quietly, "Alexander, I must speak with you about what is being said," but he cut her off with cold precision. "What society says is of no consequence, Eleanor. You are the Duchess of Ashworth, and that should be sufficient." And she felt the words like a door closing, understood that he was retreating behind rank and title, that the man who had sat with her in the garden and almost laughed at her observations had disappeared back into the armor of his position, and when she tried again to reach him, to ask him directly if he believed the accusations, he simply looked at her with eyes gone distant and said, "I think it best if we maintain appropriate formality, while in London the season requires certain standards of conduct." And Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, and the fragile hope she had been nurturing, shattered by the realization that perhaps nothing had truly changed at all, that she was once again alone, only now with so much more to lose. Alexander Greystone, Duke of Ashworth, stood at the window of his London study in the grey hours before dawn, watching the lamplight flicker against the cobblestones below, and he was haunted by the memory of another woman in another season 5 years past, when he had been young enough to believe that love and trust were simple things, before Clarissa Pemberton, cousin to the venomous Lady Pemberton, who now tormented his wife, had taught him the bitter lesson that affection could be performed, that sweetness could mask calculation, that a woman might endure his company, and even counterfeit desire, for nothing more than the privilege of being called Duchess. He had loved her with the wholehearted abandon of a man who had not yet learned caution, had shared his thoughts and fears and dreams, had believed her tears and declarations, and when he had overheard her laughing with her brother about how tedious she found him, how his conversation bored her, how she could scarce bear his touch but would endure anything for a coronet. Something inside him had frozen solid and never truly thawed, and he had vowed that day that no woman would ever again have the power to make him feel small and foolish and used. Eleanor's presence in his life terrified him precisely because she was undermining every defense he had constructed, the warmth that had grown between them in the countryside, threatening the careful ice that had protected him, and when she smiled at something he said or met his eyes across the breakfast table, with that particular understanding in her gaze, he felt the treacherous stirrings of hope and immediately crushed them with memories of Clarissa's beautiful, false face. The evidence of Eleanor's genuine nature accumulated daily: her kindness to servants who could offer her nothing, and her restoration of his mother's garden, not for show, but in the quiet hours, when she thought herself unobserved, the intelligence and wit she displayed without any attempt to charm or manipulate, her dignity, under society's continued assault, when a calculating woman would have wept or raged or demanded his intervention, and yet the old wounds whispered their poison, suggesting that perhaps she was simply more skilled than Clarissa, more patient in her game, and the thought that he might be fool enough to fall for practiced innocence a second time made him retreat behind the walls that had kept him safe, even as part of him recognized the terrible injustice he was doing her. He watched her now from the shadows of the Beaumont ball, saw her standing alone near the terrace doors in her emerald silk, her spine straight and head high despite the cutting remarks he knew she had endured, and something twisted in his chest at her solitary grace, the way she maintained her composure when other women would have crumbled or fled, and he thought suddenly of his mother, and who had possessed that same quiet strength, who had told him once when he was small that true character revealed itself not in comfort but in adversity, in how one bore oneself when the world was unkind. Eleanor turned slightly, perhaps feeling his gaze, and their eyes met across the crowded room, and in that moment before she looked away, he saw something that made his breath catch, not calculation or performance, but simply profound loneliness and pain, the raw honesty of a woman who had given up trying to prove herself and was merely enduring, and the recognition struck him like a physical blow. She was real, her kindness genuine, her feelings true, and he had been too much a coward to trust the evidence before his own eyes, had let the ghost of an old betrayal blind him to the remarkable woman who had somehow, impossibly, come to care for him despite every reason not to. Eleanor waited until the following afternoon, when the social obligations had temporarily ceased and the household had settled into its quiet rhythms, and she sent word requesting a private audience with her husband in his study, her hands steady as she penned the note, though her heart beat against her ribs, like something caged and desperate for freedom. When she entered the book-lined sanctuary where he conducted his business, he rose from behind his desk with careful courtesy, his face arranged in that expression of polite neutrality that she had come to despise, and she closed the door behind her with deliberate precision before turning to face him, gathering every fragment of dignity she possessed like armor against the terrible vulnerability of what she was about to do. "I will not keep you long, Your Grace," she began, and saw him flinch slightly at the formal address, though whether from guilt or irritation she could not tell. "I merely wish to clarify our arrangement going forward, so that we might both understand what is expected and avoid any further confusion." He opened his mouth as if to speak, but she raised one hand slightly, needing to finish before her courage failed, and continued, with a voice that remained steady through sheer force of will. I understand that whatever small friendship we had begun to build in the countryside was a temporary aberration, perhaps a result of proximity and limited society, and that here in London you prefer to maintain the distance originally negotiated in our marriage contract. This is your right, and I will not contest it." She watched something flicker across his features, pain, perhaps, or anger, or relief, but his expression shuttered before she could interpret it, and his silence felt like confirmation of every terrible fear that had haunted her sleepless nights. "I offer you this assurance," Eleanor said, and her voice remained quiet but carried the weight of absolute finality. "I will maintain all public appearances befitting the Duchess of Ashworth. I will fulfill whatever social obligations you require, and I will not shame you or your name with any display of emotion or complaint. But I will not defend myself against accusations of calculation or social climbing, not to society and not to you, because a woman who must constantly prove her sincerity possesses no dignity, and dignity is the only thing I have left that truly belongs to me." She saw his hands clench on the edge of his desk, saw his throat work as if he might speak, but still he said nothing, and his silence was answer enough, confirmation that he believed at least some portion of what society whispered about her, that he suspected her kindness might be performance, and her growing affection merely strategy. "I will retire to the country estate tomorrow morning," Eleanor announced, and watched his head snap up, genuine alarm breaking through his careful neutrality. "You need not accompany me indeed. I think it better if you do not, and I will remain there for the duration of the season, unless you have specific need of my presence for some social obligation, in which case I will of course return immediately upon your request." The words were coming faster now, her composure beginning to crack at the edges, and she forced herself to slow, to maintain the dignity that was all she had. "I will not burden you with expectations of affection or companionship. Alexander, I release you from any obligation beyond what was originally contracted, and I ask only that you grant me the same courtesy and allow me to build whatever life I can in the space you have given me." She turned toward the door before he could see the tears that were beginning to blur her vision, before the careful control she had maintained could shatter completely, and his voice finally broke his silence, hoarse and strange. "Eleanor, wait." But she was already opening the door and already stepping through, and she said without turning back, "There is nothing more to discuss, Your Grace. I believe we understand each other perfectly now." She left him standing in his study and returned to her chambers, where she instructed her maid to pack her trunks, and the next morning before dawn she departed for the country estate in the Ashworth travelling coach, watching the London townhouse recede into the grey morning mist, and she did not know that Alexander stood at his study window watching her leave, did not see him raise one hand to the glass as if he might call her back, did not hear the single word he spoke into the empty room like a prayer or a curse. No. The weeks that followed Eleanor's departure stretched into a strange, suspended time, as late spring softened into the golden haze of early summer, and in the country estate she threw herself into the work of living with a determination born of necessity, rising each morning before dawn to walk through the gardens, where dew still clung to the roses she had planted, her hands finding solace in the honest labor of coaxing beauty from the earth when her heart remained stubbornly barren of hope. She met with tenants who had seemed surprised at first by her continued presence and attention, then gradually opened to her genuine interest in their welfare, and she found a kind of peace in the practical problems of crop rotations and roof repairs, and an elderly widow who needed assistance, occupying her mind with matters that had clear solutions, when her marriage remained an unsolvable puzzle of hurt and longing and resigned acceptance. "This is enough," she told herself each night as she fell exhausted into bed. "This work matters. These people need me. I can build a life of purpose, even if it will never hold the love I had been foolish enough to hope for." And if the assertion felt hollow in the darkness of her chamber, she pushed the emptiness aside and rose the next morning to try again. In London, Alexander discovered that solitude was not the victory he had once imagined, but rather a peculiar form of torture, the townhouse echoing with absence, every room holding the ghost of Eleanor's presence, the library where she had sat reading in the window seat, the music room where he had once heard her playing piano when she thought herself alone, the breakfast room where her chair sat empty across from his and made each meal an exercise in regret. He attended his social obligations with mechanical precision, aware of the whispers about the absent Duchess, the speculation about their separation, and he found he cared nothing for society's opinion, except insofar as it might wound Eleanor further, and the realization of his own hypocrisy, that he had retreated from her partially due to fear of what society said, yet now would gladly damn them all, sat bitter on his tongue. His elderly aunt, the Dowager Countess of Helmsley, arrived unannounced one afternoon in early June, and found him in his study staring at correspondence he had not read, and she surveyed him with sharp eyes that missed nothing before announcing without preamble, "You are a fool, Alexander, and I have never suffered fools gladly, even when they share my blood." When he attempted to deflect her censure, she cut through his words with the precision of someone who had navigated society for 7 decades and had no patience left for pretense. "That girl, and she is hardly more than a girl, for all her dignity, refused every financial settlement your solicitor offered, asked only for funds to continue the garden work and provision for the staff, and you sit here playing the wounded martyr as if she were the one who betrayed trust." The words struck him like physical blows, and when he made the journey to see Eleanor's father some days later, ostensibly to discuss estate business, but actually to understand the woman he had married and driven away, Thomas Hartley spoke of a daughter who had nursed her dying mother with tireless devotion, who had given her childhood to keeping house for a grieving widower, who had accepted a loveless marriage to save her father's honor, and had never once complained of the sacrifice. And Alexander left that meeting with the terrible knowledge that every fear he had harbored about Eleanor's character was not merely wrong, but the precise inverse of truth she had wanted. Nothing from him except what he had been too, afraid to give. Alexander spent the next days in a state of restless examination that felt like coming out of a long fever, seeing clearly for the first time the architecture of his own fear and how meticulously he had constructed prison walls while calling them protection, and he understood now with painful clarity that every defense he had built against betrayal had created the very abandonment he most dreaded, a self-fulfilling prophecy born of pride and old wounds that had festered rather than healed. He walked through the London townhouse at odd hours, unable to sleep, replaying every interaction with Eleanor, her dignity at Almack's when the world had scorned her, her quiet acceptance of a loveless arrangement when she might have refused, her patient work in the garden seeking no praise or acknowledgement, her steady kindness to servants and tenants who held no social power to advance her position, and each memory was evidence that demolished his careful edifice of suspicion, showing him a woman whose strength came not from calculation, but from the very background he had been taught to disdain. Her merchant father had raised her without the ton's elaborate games of status and manipulation, had taught her the value of honest work and direct dealing, had given her an education that prized intelligence over accomplishment and character over connections, and Alexander saw with shame how his own aristocratic prejudice had blinded him to the reality that Eleanor's origins had made her more genuine, not less, had given her a moral clarity that his own gilded upbringing had never provided. The realization that his pride, the very pride he had thought distinguished his rank, had been the poison destroying any chance of happiness, was bitter medicine, and he sat in his study one evening with his head in his hands, understanding that he had wounded the one person who had never sought to harm him, had driven away the woman whose only crime was loving him despite his determination to remain unlovable. He thought of his mother then, truly thought of her rather than the sanitized memory he had clung to, and remembered how she had often spoken of his father's initial coldness, their arranged marriage, the years of patience she had employed before his father's reserve had thawed. "Love is not found, Alexander," she had told him once when he was young. "It is built, stone by stone, through small acts of faith," and he realized he had forgotten her wisdom in his determination to avoid her fate, not understanding that her marriage had not been tragedy but triumph, that she had considered the years of building worthwhile for the love they had finally achieved. He must act, must find some way to prove to Eleanor that he understood his failure and was willing to do the patient work of rebuilding what his fear had destroyed. And his first instinct was toward grand gesture, a ball in her honor, a public declaration, some dramatic demonstration that society could witness and applaud, but he stopped himself, recognizing that such spectacle was exactly what Eleanor would despise, that it would prove only that he still cared more for appearance than substance. No, what Eleanor deserved was not performance but genuine transformation, not words but sustained action, not the dramatic crescendo but the quiet accumulation of proof over time, and he understood that he must go to her not as a duke bestowing favor, but as a man asking for the opportunity to earn what he had been too frightened to accept when it was freely offered. He made his preparations carefully, informing his steward he would be leaving London indefinitely, arranging his affairs so he might stay at the country estate for as long as Eleanor would permit his presence, and as his carriage rolled north through the summer countryside toward the place where he had last seen happiness, before fear had made him destroy it, Alexander felt something he had not experienced in years, not certainty, which was impossible given how thoroughly he had damaged her trust, but hope, fragile and tentative, that perhaps patience and genuine repentance might accomplish what pride and protection never could. Alexander arrived at the country estate in late August, when summer had reached that golden moment of fullness before the first whisper of autumn, and he found Eleanor in the garden as he had somehow known he would, kneeling beside a bed of roses with earth on her hands and sunlight caught in her hair, and she was more beautiful in that unguarded moment than any perfectly coiffed duchess in London's finest ballrooms, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with the knowledge of what he had nearly lost forever through his own cowardice and pride. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path, and he watched wariness shutter her expression, the open contentment of a moment before replaced by careful guardedness, and he understood that this mistrust he had created where there had once been patience and hope was his doing, his wound inflicted through fear masquerading as protection. "Your Grace," she said, rising to her feet with the dignity that had always marked her bearing, and the formal address was a knife to his heart, a reminder of the distance he had imposed between them when she had wanted only closeness. "Eleanor," he said, and her given name felt like both prayer and plea on his tongue, "might I speak with you? I have travelled from London expressly for that purpose, and I will understand if you refuse, but I beg for a few moments of your time." He saw the conflict play across her features, the desire to protect herself, warring with something else he dared not name, and after a long moment she nodded slowly, gesturing toward a bench beneath an arbor, where climbing roses created a canopy of faded blooms. They sat, and he found himself momentarily unable to speak, all the carefully prepared words dissolving in the face of her proximity and the terrible knowledge of how thoroughly he had failed her, but she waited with that patient stillness that was so essentially Eleanor, giving him space to find his way to truth. "I have been a fool," he began finally, the words inadequate but necessary, "and worse than a fool I have been cruel and cowardly, and so blinded by old wounds that I could not see the gift I had been given until I had driven it away." He turned to face her fully, needing her to see his sincerity, the vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show. "You deserved honesty from me, and trust, and instead I gave you suspicion born not from anything you did, but from my own fear and pride. I allowed the betrayal of someone who never truly knew me to poison my ability to recognize genuine affection when it was offered, and I am more sorry than any words can convey for the pain I have caused you." Eleanor's eyes had filled with tears, though she did not let them fall. And her voice when she spoke was steady, despite the emotion he could see. She was holding carefully in check. "Why now, Alexander? What has changed between your silence in London and your presence here?" It was the question he had known she would ask, the question he deserved to answer with complete truth. "I have changed, or rather, I have finally allowed myself to see what was always true, that you never wanted anything from me except what I was too frightened to give, that your character is everything I claimed to value, while being too prejudiced to recognize it when it stood before me, and that I love you, Eleanor, and have perhaps loved you since that first night at Almack's, when you met the ton's cruelty with such dignity and met my gaze without flinching." He saw hope kindle in her expression, fragile and tentative, but also fear, and she shook her head slowly. "I cannot live with uncertainty, Alexander. I cannot spend my days wondering when you will retreat again behind your walls, when some whisper or doubt will cause you to withdraw your affection. I would rather have honest distance than the torture of conditional closeness." "I know," he said quietly, reaching for her hand and feeling his heart lift when she did not pull away. "And I know that words alone cannot heal what I have broken, which is why I ask not for your immediate forgiveness, but for the opportunity to prove through sustained action that my understanding is genuine. That I can be the husband you deserved from the beginning. Permit me to stay. Eleanor, Let me demonstrate through patience and presence that I have finally learned what you tried to teach me all along. Permit me to stay, Alexander said quietly, and Eleanor saw in his eyes something she had never witnessed before, not the cold reserve or careful control, but raw vulnerability and hope so fragile it made her heart ache even as she feared trusting it. She nodded slowly, unable yet to voice full acceptance, but unable also to deny him the chance he requested. And so began days that felt suspended outside normal time, a golden interlude where Alexander proved through steady presence what words alone could never accomplish. He appeared in the garden each morning, not as a duke observing but as a man willing to work, and he knelt beside her in the soil, pulling weeds and learning the names of plants, his fine clothes forgotten as he listened to her explain the careful cultivation each variety required. And she found herself relaxing in increments so small she hardly noticed, until she realized she was explaining not just gardening, but her thoughts, her philosophy, the way she saw growth as metaphor for all worthwhile things. They met with tenants together, and Eleanor watched Alexander truly see for the first time how she had spent her months of solitude, not in bitter isolation but in genuine care for the people whose lives depended on the estate, visiting families, learning children's names, understanding each household's particular struggles and hopes, and she saw respect dawn in his expression as he recognized that she had been a duchess in truth, while he had been merely performing the role. Their conversations stretched longer each day, extending through afternoon tea and into evening, and Alexander began to share with a vulnerability that stunned her, speaking of his mother not just as sanitized memory but as full person, admitting how her death had left him terrified of loving and losing again, confessing how his father's subsequent coldness had taught him that walls were safer than feeling, revealing the lonely architecture of a childhood spent learning to need nothing from anyone. He spoke of his fears with raw honesty, how her merchant background had initially seemed to confirm all his prejudices, how her patience and kindness had terrified him precisely because it was genuine, how he had looked for calculation, because that would have been safer than accepting that she offered affection freely, asking nothing but that he receive it, and Eleanor felt her own walls crumbling as she understood the depth of wound he had been carrying. Small gestures accumulated like interest compounding, books appearing in her chambers that she had mentioned wanting to read weeks ago, proving he had listened and remembered. The garden gate that had hung crooked, suddenly repaired without fanfare. His coat offered when evening chill arrived during their walks, still warm from his shoulders. They laughed one evening over dinner, genuine and unguarded laughter at some absurdity he observed about his own earlier pomposity, and the sound shocked them both into silence before Eleanor smiled, and he returned it with such warmth that she felt heat rise to her cheeks. A morning came when they worked side by side planting bulbs for spring bloom, and their hands touched reaching for the same seed packet, and neither pulled away immediately, the contact lingering as their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze everything he was too wise now to rush into words: devotion, hope, patience, to wait as long as she needed. Eleanor felt cautious hope unfurling in her chest, like the first green shoot after winter, fragile but reaching toward light. And though she did not speak it aloud yet, she began to believe that perhaps what had been broken might be remade into something even stronger for having been tested and survived. Autumn arrived with golden light that transformed the estate into something luminous and fleeting, and on a morning when the air held that peculiar clarity that comes just before the season turns, Alexander asked Eleanor to walk with him, his manner containing a gravity that made her heart quicken with mingled hope and apprehension as she placed her hand in his offered arm. He led her through the garden they had restored together, past beds where late roses still bloomed in defiant beauty, into a section she had completed just weeks before, a quiet corner where a stone bench sat beneath an arbor of climbing vines. And only as they approached did she see the inscription carved into the bench's back, words she had never noticed before. "For Catherine, who taught me that love grows best in carefully tended ground. My father had this made for my mother," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying a tenderness she had come to cherish. After 20 years of marriage that began much as ours did, arranged, practical, two strangers bound by duty and expectation. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing emotion play across features that had once been so carefully guarded, and he continued, "My mother told me once, when I was young enough to believe love was simple, that the greatest marriages are not those that begin in passion, but those that grow into it, through patience and genuine knowing. She said that her love for my father was like this garden, something that required daily tending and faith that what seemed barren would eventually bloom. He drew a small velvet box from his pocket, and Eleanor's breath caught as he opened it, to reveal a ring of extraordinary simplicity, a single sapphire, the color of twilight set in worn gold. Beautiful not for ostentation but for the evidence of years of wearing, of a life lived with this small circle as constant companion. "This was my mother's ring," Alexander said, and she heard the slight tremor in his voice. "Not the grand ducal jewels she wore for state occasions, but the one my father gave her on their 10th anniversary, when he finally found the courage to tell her he loved her. She wore it every day until her death, and she made me promise to keep it for the woman I truly loved, not merely married." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as Alexander knelt before her on the ground his mother had once tended, his proud bearing transformed into vulnerability and hope. "I married you once for duty and fear, Eleanor, and spent months too blind to see what I had been given, but I am asking you now, here in the place my mother would have loved to see bloom again, to marry me a second time, not in law but in truth, not as convenience but as choice." He held the ring up, and golden light caught in the sapphire's depths. "Marry me again, Eleanor, in heart this time, and let me spend whatever years I am granted, proving that I can tend what we are growing together with the same patience and devotion you have shown me. Say, you will be not just my duchess, but my beloved wife, my truest friend, the one I choose freely, knowing all that choice means." Eleanor sank to her knees before him, propriety forgotten in the face of such offered devotion, and she took his face between her hands as she had never dared before. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you again and again. In every moment we are granted, I choose you as you are choosing me, freely and fully and forever." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it settled as if it had always belonged there, and then he was kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of reverence and promise, and she tasted salt from tears she could not tell were his or hers or both, only that they were together now in truth, two people who had found their way through duty and distance to this moment of genuine devotion. This recognition that what they had built together was stronger for having been tested and chosen rather than simply accepted, and when they finally drew apart, they were both laughing and crying at once, overwhelmed by the simple, profound joy of having found each other at last. Their return to London came as autumn painted the city in shades of amber and rust, and though Eleanor felt apprehension tightening her chest as their carriage rolled through familiar streets toward the townhouse, Alexander's hand covering hers provided courage she had not possessed on her first entry into society's glittering, judgmental world. The transformation in their relationship was evident to anyone with eyes to see the way Alexander handed her down from the carriage with tenderness rather than mere courtesy. How his gaze followed her with unmistakable devotion, the small unconscious touches that spoke of genuine intimacy, and within days of their arrival, whispers began circulating through drawing rooms and clubs that the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth had become a love match, that something profound had shifted during their months in the country. When they attended their first ball of the season at the Wetherby residence, Eleanor felt the weight of scrutiny as they were announced, but this time she walked not alone, but with Alexander's solid presence beside her, his hand at the small of her back, both protective and proprietary, in a way that proclaimed his devotion to anyone watching. Lady Pemberton, whose sharp tongue had delivered so many cuts during that miserable first season, approached with her usual entourage, her expression calculating, as she offered congratulations on their marriage, with words that dripped false sweetness. And then, with the casual cruelty Eleanor remembered too well, she added, "How fortunate that some managed to rise so far above their natural station, though I suppose even merchants' daughters may learn polish given sufficient motivation and instruction." The words hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor felt old, hurt, rising even as she prepared to respond with the dignity she had learned to wield as both shield and sword. But Alexander's voice cut through the moment with a coldness that made the temperature seem to drop. "Lady Pemberton, I find myself compelled to correct a misapprehension that appears to plague certain members of society who mistake antiquity of name for superiority of character." His tone carried the absolute authority of his position, drawing attention from surrounding guests as he continued. My wife's worth has nothing to do with fortune or station, but rather with her extraordinary character, her genuine compassion and her remarkable intelligence, and her capacity for grace under circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. She has taught me that true nobility lies not in inherited titles, but in how one treats those with less power, and by that measure, she surpasses most of the supposed elite of this company, myself formerly included. Eleanor saw Lady Pemberton's face flush with humiliation as Alexander turned his back on her with deliberate dismissal, leading Eleanor away while conversations erupted around them like wildfire. And she felt something settle in her chest, not triumph, for she had never wanted vindication through others' humiliation, but rather a quiet recognition that Alexander's public declaration had been less about social warfare and more about simple truth spoken without apology or hesitation. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor noticed a shift in how society received her not universal acceptance, for there would always be those who clung to prejudice and narrow definitions of worth, but a growing respect and even admiration for the Duchess, who carried herself with quiet dignity, and whose husband's devotion was so evident that it spoke more eloquently than any defense. Yet Eleanor found, somewhat to her surprise, that this acceptance mattered far less than it once might have. She attended balls and social functions because duty required it, but her happiness no longer depended on society's approval, and when Alexander leaned close during a particularly tedious musicale to whisper that they might slip away early to return home, she felt joy bloom in her chest at the prospect not of escape, but of the private world they had built together, the life that mattered more than any ballroom's glittering superficiality. They departed that evening while the entertainment continued, and as their carriage rolled through lamplit streets toward home, Alexander pulled her close, and Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that they were returning not to duty or obligation, but to the genuine partnership they had cultivated with such patience and care, and she understood finally that the sneers at Almack's had led her not to humiliation, but to something far more valuable, a love that had been tested and chosen and built on the strongest foundation of all, two people who saw each other clearly and chose devotion anyway. 3 years had passed like the turning of seasons that mark all profound transformations, and on a spring morning when apple blossoms drifted through air sweet with the promise of renewal, Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room, watching a scene that filled her heart with such fullness. She sometimes wondered how one chest could contain so much joy without simply bursting from the abundance of it all. In the garden below, the garden that had become both symbol and proof of what patience and devotion could cultivate, 2 small boys chased each other through paths lined with early roses, their laughter bright as bells, while their father knelt in the grass with their youngest, a girl of 18 months whose dark curls caught sunlight as Alexander showed her how to cup a flower gently in small hands that were just learning the difference between wonder and damage. Eleanor felt arms slip around her waist from behind, but it was not Alexander. He was below with their children, but rather the echo of a memory, the ghost of the woman who had stood alone at Almack's believing herself unwanted and unworthy, and she sent that phantom a message across time. Asterisk, you cannot see it now, but the sneers that wound you are leading you towards something more beautiful than you can imagine. Asterisk. Alexander looked up then as if sensing her gaze, and the smile he gave her held such unguarded tenderness that she marveled still at how completely he had transformed from the cold, defended man who had married her with frost in his voice and winter in his eyes. Though she knew the truth was more complex, that he had not so much transformed as finally revealed what had always existed beneath the protective ice, and it was she who had learned to see clearly, to wait patiently, to trust that what seemed frozen might actually be only sleeping. She left the window and made her way to the garden, stepping into morning light that gilded everything it touched, and when she reached Alexander he stood and pulled her close with easy affection, this casual intimacy now so natural between them that she could hardly remember the careful distance of their early months, though she remembered enough to treasure what they had built through conscious choice and daily tending. "Do you remember?" Alexander murmured against her hair as their children played around them in happy oblivion to anything but immediate joy. "When you first began working in this garden, and I thought you were trying to haunt me with my mother's memory." Eleanor laughed softly, tilting her face up to meet his eyes, those grey eyes that had once seemed cold as winter storms, but that she now knew held depths of warmth reserved only for those he loved. I remember you watching from the window as if I were performing some kind of witchcraft rather than simple planting. You were performing witchcraft, he said seriously, though humor played at the corners of his mouth, bringing dead things back to life, making me feel things I had sworn never to feel again. If that is not magic, I do not know what is. Their eldest son, William, ran up then demanding his father's attention for some crucial matter involving a snail, and Alexander swept the boy up with the easy strength of a man completely comfortable in his role as father, and Eleanor watched the two of them examine the creature with solemn attention while their daughter toddled over to grip Eleanor's skirts, and she lifted the child into her arms, breathing in that particular sweetness of sun-warmed hair and innocent trust. Later, when the children had been taken inside for their midday meal, and Eleanor and Alexander walked alone through the garden paths, he stopped at the bench that bore his mother's inscription and drew Eleanor down beside him, his hand finding hers with the unconscious certainty of long habit. "I am grateful," he said quietly, "every single day, for that cold night at Almack's when a merchant's daughter refused to look away from a proud fool's stare. I am grateful for your father's desperation that gave me an excuse to bind you to me even when I was too blind to know what I was gaining. I am grateful for every moment of our journey, even the painful ones, because they brought us here to this life we have built together." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full of the same gratitude, the same wonder at how completely their cold beginning had bloomed into this warm abundance. And she thought of all the small moments that had accumulated, like compound interest into the wealth of their current happiness, the shared books, the morning rides, the conversations that had gradually lengthened from minutes to hours, the garden restored together, the ring offered in autumn light, the children conceived in genuine love rather than mere duty, and she understood that their story had never been about social vindication or proving worth to a judgmental world, but rather about two wounded people learning to trust again, to be vulnerable again, to choose devotion despite fear and past pain. "I would live through all of it again," Eleanor said softly. "Every sneer, every lonely meal, every moment of uncertainty. I would endure it all again, knowing it led to this, to you, to the life we share and the family we have created." Alexander turned her face to his and kissed her with a tenderness that still had the power to make her breath catch, and when he drew back, his eyes held that look she had come to cherish above all others. The look that said she was seen completely and loved entirely, not despite her origins but including them, not for what she could provide but for who she was in her essential self. They sat together as afternoon light slanted golden through the leaves, two people who had traveled from cold arrangement to profound partnership, and Eleanor knew that if she could send a message to her younger self standing alone at the edge of that glittering ballroom, she would say simply, "Asterisk, the sneers do not define you, and the journey through them will lead you home." Asterisk.